Hello, everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk Opera. My name is Joshua Borths, and I'm the resident scholar here at Virginia Opera, and I am delighted to welcome you to the third opera of the 22-23 season, the contemporary masterpiece, Fellow Travelers. This is a piece that is near and dear to my heart, and I hope whether you are joining us live to think about and learn about and listen to Fellow Travelers as you prepare for performances, or if you are listening to this later, possibly getting in your car or something like that as you head to performance and listening to this as a podcast, I hope that our insights this evening only help enrich your opera going experience. So to get us started, Fellow Travelers, the basic background. This is a contemporary masterpiece that premiered in 2016, and we'll talk about the creators of it and the story and all of those details in just a moment. But I want to begin, instead of talking about Fellow Travelers first, I want to begin with the context, the kind of zeitgeist, the spirit of the age where we find ourselves when we are looking at contemporary opera. And contemporary opera has been in the public eye a lot recently, particularly around the New York Times reporting that the Metropolitan Opera, in response to ticket sales and a bunch of other factors, including the COVID pandemic, was going to be reshuffling their season to incorporate a lot more modern work. And for many people, if you read the comments of the New York Times, that really took them by surprise. But it is interesting and noteworthy that it is the new operas that are selling out the Met. It is new operas that are bringing a vibrancy and relevancy to opera that has always been there, but is now coming forth through the public eye. Now, a lot of people have some trepidation about contemporary opera. Maybe you're one of those people. Maybe you're one of those people who isn't quite sure what to think about opera that's not Verdi, Puccini, or Mozart. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about what we mean by contemporary opera and some trends that we see in this fascinating and diverse genre. First, I want to begin by saying that modern opera and contemporary opera are not the same thing. You'll notice here in our first slide on contemporary opera, we see that in the early 20th century, composers were interested in extremes. This is the style of opera that many opera goers associate with contemporary opera. This is opera that is pushing music as far as it can possibly go, past the point of what we say tonality, past the point of where it sounds beautiful. This was a part of an overall trend towards exploring the outer limits of music. And this was in response to changes in society, technology, things like World War I and eventually World War II, changes in kind of how Western cultures operated. And so each art form was pushing itself as far as it could possibly go, hence that term extremism. A lot of people, therefore, got a little turned off to contemporary opera with this music. What's worth discussing is that what we're talking about here with contemporary opera is not the same as this modernism of the early 20th century, this age of extremes, this age of pushing music past the point of beauty, pushing dance to the point where ballet dancers don't have to wear point shoes. Paintings don't have to have figures in them. You can, in the case of Jackson Pollock, literally throw painting on a canvas. Taking structures out of novels and giving a stream of consciousness. Poetry doesn't have to rhyme. Hopefully you're getting my drift at how extreme, provocative, and self-consciously different these modern composers were. This is what a lot of people have in their minds when they think of modern opera or contemporary opera, excuse me. But this is not what actually this music sounds like, because in the middle of the century, composers shifted their approach. And I like to think about this as the age of globalism. The kind of term that's thrown around is postmodernism, which gets a little ivory tower in many ways. But I want you to think about globalism, this coming together of art form and audience, this coming together of different art forms. Essentially, to give you an extended metaphor, what happened in music and art in the early 20th century is that Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall and fell. He had a great fall. And we see all of these splinters and shards of the individual extreme elements of the artistic world of Western culture. But then, in the middle of the 20th century and beyond, we start to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Audience and art, film and opera, dance and symphony, all of these things coming together in surprising and interesting ways to make something new, something that is global, hence globalism. So, if when you think of contemporary opera, you think of the thorny dissonances of the early 20th century, that's now 100 years old. We are now in a new era. And it's this era of globalism, this era of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. What you may or may not know is there have been more world premieres in the past 25 years than the previous 75. Let me reiterate that. There have been more world premieres in the past 25 years than the previous 75 years. That takes us back almost to the time of Puccini. That is how vibrant this art form is right now as we look at contemporary operas. And there are three giant trends that I want us to track and see play out in Fellow Travelers this evening and when you experience the opera for yourself. First, diversity. I'm talking about a diversity of creative team. I'm talking about a diversity of composers, a diversity of cultures that are represented. But I'm not exclusively talking about the diversity of the people who are creating opera to be experienced on the stage. No, I am also talking about a diversity of musical styles. In contemporary opera, you get all kinds of influences from American Broadway musicals to film scores to the music of indigenous cultures to rock to pop, everything kind of coming together, which means that none of these operas sound like each other. That is one of the things that is so miraculous about the diversity of contemporary opera, is that each piece is its own special thing, bringing together influences from a variety of sources. So diversity, and we'll see that play out. And hopefully you'll see that play out in Fellow Travelers when you experience this great work. Secondly, an interest in beauty and accessibility. Beauty and accessibility, a coming together, as I said, of art and audience. That's not to say that there's not dissonance in contemporary opera. There certainly is, but there is an awareness that this music needs to be approached and understood on a first listen. This is something that is common in contemporary opera. And when audiences experience it, can sometimes be taken by surprise and delighted at just how beautiful this music can be. And even when it's not, there is a specific purpose to it. There is an active communication between the stage, orchestra pit, and audience throughout the evening or matinee, the afternoon that you are experiencing the work. And finally, this is opera that is focused on relevant stories and often dealing with social issues or political issues. And I'm not talking partisanship here. I'm talking about how we interact as a society. You may or may not know it, but opera throughout its history is kind of a metronome going back and forth, marking time. And one of the trends that we can see going back and forth is if the stories that are happening on the stage are speaking directly to the audience and the language of that audience. There have been times in opera's history where composers have not been allowed, due to censorship, due to various other political and social factors that are on the ground, are not able to actually express the story that they want to. A lot of operas by Giuseppe Verdi, for example, he had to change text, he had to change plot points, he had to change character names in order to obscure what he was trying to say about Italian society and culture at that time. Today, we have the luxury, we have the freedom of being able to put stories directly out there that speak in the language and in the style of the people who are experiencing it. So diversity, beauty, and relevance. These are three trends that we can see across contemporary opera. That's a little different from the trends of modernism 100 years ago. So again, if you have this image of dissonant sounds means contemporary opera, get rid of that. That's outdated at this point. We are now in this global age, this postmodern age, this contemporary age, where our stories get to sing, and you as an audience member get to be invited into the experience from the get-go. So, quick review. We talked about some trends that we see across the incredibly diverse repertoire of contemporary opera, the fact that there's so many new pieces being created. And we talked about how this is really kind of hitting the zeitgeist with what's happening in the Metropolitan Opera and all of the great work that is happening across the United States in opera companies. Virginia Opera is not only producing Fellow Travelers, but we've announced that in the spring of 25, a world premiere based on Loving versus Virginia. This is a trend that we see across all companies in the United States and is a thrilling shift in the programming and culture of opera across the nation and the world as we have this great renaissance for contemporary opera. I want to take a quick minute and if you've just joined us, welcome. If you are not logged into Facebook or YouTube, I encourage you to do so. And I encourage you to write questions as we go through this evening and as we turn our attention specifically to Fellow Travelers. I'm going to keep my eye on that comments page. And if you're watching this after the fact, I encourage you to still comment, ask questions. I will be referring to this YouTube channel in order to answer any questions that you may have or any thoughts that come your way as you engage with one of these masterpieces of contemporary opera. So, Fellow Travelers, as I mentioned, contemporary work. It premiered in 2016 and is based on the novel Fellow Travelers by Thomas Mallon, which came out in 2007. It's also worth noting that this novel, which is a fantastic novel, I highly encourage you to read it if you want to compare the novel to the adaptation on the operatic stage. It's a great piece and has been optioned, I believe, by Showtime for a limited series that'll premiering at some point soon, starring Matthew Bonner as one of our leads and Jonathan Bailey, who you may know from Bridgerton, as the two men who are at the center and the heart of this work. The novel was selected to be adapted by its original creative team, many of whom are involved in the production that you will see at Virginia Opera. The person who was in charge of adapting the words of Thomas Mallon and taking this kind of epic novel and distilling it down to its operatic form was librettist Greg Pierce. My name's got off one, so Greg Pierce is the one with the glasses, third from the left. And his collaborator was composer Greg Spears. The two of them then worked very closely with stage director Kevin Newberry, who is directing the production here at Virginia Opera. And the three of them crafted this piece over a number of years and really felt a strong connection to it. It's worth noting that our composer, Greg Spears, is a native of Virginia. He's a native of Virginia Beach. And this is one of the first times that his operas are being produced in his home state. He grew up going to student nights at Virginia Opera. So we are delighted to now be reciprocating and presenting the operas of this composer who is just breaking through on the national scene in a variety of ways. He just had a world premiere of a piece called Castor and Patience. I highly recommend you check it out at Cincinnati Opera this past summer, and it has major world premieres coming up at the Santa Fe Opera and beyond. Our librettist, by the way, Greg Pierce, if you keep an eye on the Opera Pulse, you may have noticed his name, for he wrote the libretto for the Metropolitan Opera's new production, their world premiere that just happened a few months ago, an adaptation of the novel The Hours that starred Renee Fleming, Kelly O'Hara, and Joyce DiDonato. Another wonderful example of the contemporary trends that we see happening in opera houses across the country. Kevin Newberry is just as noteworthy as all of the other collaborators that I have talked about thus far and has championed new work. He's directed at most of the major opera houses across the United States and beyond, and has been responsible for thrilling productions, again, particularly of world premieres. The opera of Bel Canto, for example, based on the prominent novel bestseller that is about an opera singer essentially in Latin America. And kind of the instances surrounding a domestic terrorism event. That opera he directed, among many, many others. All of them came together and combined forces, and the original premiere took place at Cincinnati Opera, which is, interestingly, one of the oldest opera companies in the country. And being from Cincinnati originally myself, it's where I saw my first operas. So I am so glad that Cincinnati is so represented in this diverse world of contemporary opera, like Virginia Opera and beyond. So we have these four kind of masters working at the height of their craft: Thomas Malin, composer Gregory Spears, librettist Greg Pierce, and stage director Kevin Newberry. So what is this story that they presented, and how did they adapt it? How did they bring it onto the operatic stage? Well, to begin answering that question, let's go on a little history lesson, if we will, for this is a work of historical fiction set during the age of McCarthy and the Red Scare in the middle of the 20th century. This is a time period that, interestingly, not a whole lot of people from my generation have learned formally. High school years tend to run out of time by the time you get to like World War II. So this is a time period that a lot of people may not know a lot about. Some of you may have lived through this, depending on your life experience. And I hope that you chime into the comments with any thoughts or any reminiscences that you may have about this important moment in American history. Coming out of World War II, the United States and the world entered a kind of new era, a new uncharted waters, if you will, between the creation of atomic weapons and the tension that was beginning to exist and boil over between the communist nations of the Soviet Union and others, and the kind of free market capitalist societies of America and Western Europe. This led to the Cold War, this kind of conflict that incorporated a lot of different proxy wars and a lot of different ideas over which was going to take over the global order. Essentially, all of these nations had kind of put all of these thoughts on hold while the atrocities of World War II were being dealt with and fought, leading to the victory, as we all know, against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And then once that conflict is over, then the next issue, the issue of ideology, the issue of these political systems came to the fore. And this led us into the Cold War, a period that takes us from the late 40s all the way up to the early 1990s. Albeit in various guises and incorporating lots of different conflicts, both cultural, geopolitical, and actual wars themselves. Leading from the late 40s into the 50s, tensions rose. And so the Cold War started to seem a little more hot. And it was during this time period that a young senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy came onto the national scene. There was a fear, there was a Red Scare, that communists had infiltrated the United States, and that within government itself, within Hollywood, Broadway, any part of kind of public life, that there were people who were sympathetic to communism, to the Soviet Union, to China and beyond, and that they had to be dealt with. This was a time of incredible paranoia that it's no consequence was also escalated by the nuclear threat that people were living with every single day during this period, not long after the actual use of these weapons at the end of World War II. And so Joseph McCarthy started to essentially try to root out communists in the federal government and the rest of American culture. This led to a number of atrocities, a number of violations of civil liberties, as Americans were accused, often with little or no evidence. They were forced into coerced confessions and psychological tactics in order to get them to confess that they were communists or they were spies or something of that ilk. Throughout all kinds of avenues in American life. Joseph McCarthy in the Senate was working with the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, as it is sometimes referred to, and they started to investigate. And the first place that they started to investigate to try to root out this red menace, to bring in the title of an anti-communist film from the late 1940s, was in the State Department. For people were afraid that those in the State Department were most able to be double agents, were most able to be spies, were most able to be blackmailed by foreign adversaries. And so the State Department is where the beginning of these investigations into communists in the federal government began. Joseph McCarthy was then got the young lawyer Roy Cohn into his fold and into his proceedings to investigate what was happening. Joseph McCarthy actually appears as a character in Fellow Travelers. And so it's very important that we understand the kind of cultural presence that he had throughout this time period. And while Roy Cohn, his lawyer, does not appear on the operatic stage, he is talked about a lot. He is alluded to. He is gossiped about as we go through. Roy Cohn is famously dramatized in the play Angels in America by the great American playwright Tony Kushner. And we realize, and this is true to history, that he died of AIDS. And so as we talk about the Lavender Scare element of the Red Scare, we can see some of the hypocrisies and bitter ironies that play out throughout this period in American history. So we have Joseph McCarthy leading this charge into rooting out communism in American government and culture, and he is aided by Roy Cohn and unofficially a man by the name of David Shine, who is insinuated at the time and in the opera Fellow Travelers to have actually been a romantic partner or a lover or what have you with Roy Cohn as all of these investigations are taking place. This led to a number of people, thousands of people, losing their jobs and being placed on blacklists, which meant that they could not work, that they were barred from being involved in the public life of America. And so thousands and thousands of people who worked in the State Department, Department of Education, Hollywood, Broadway, some of the biggest stars, some of the biggest directors, and the biggest names in culture in the 1950s were brought in front of this committee. People were forced to, quote, name names of who were the communists that they were aware of, that they associated with, and led to all kinds of domestic atrocities during this era of the Cold War. Eventually, McCarthy shifted his focus to the army, and this ended up being the beginning of the end for the American Red Scare and kind of the height of McCarthyism as this rooting out of communists had become known as. And it was when he shifted to the army and started looking for infiltrators in the army that famously it was said in a hearing, "Have you no decency?" is a paraphrase of what he said. And it was during this moment, as he's investigating the army, who is fighting the Korean War, which is happening during this time period in the early 1950s, who had just, been so heroic in World War II. The fact that they were the ones now under investigation turned public opinion against McCarthy, allowed kind of his grip on American politics to be broken and for somewhat of order to be restored. The famous moment when this shift takes place, I think, is worth looking into, and I want to show, this moment, which was broadcast on national television. Another part of the Red Scare is that it incorporated every part of American media, appearing on television, in live news, magazines, movies, you name it. So here we have, in 1954, the kind of breaking of McCarthyism as the Army investigations take root.
Mr. Chairman. May I say that Mr. Welch talks about this being cruel and reckless. He was just baiting. He has been baiting Mr. Cohen here for hours, requesting that Mr. Cohen, before sundown, get out of any department of the government anyone who is serving the communist cause. Now, I just give this man's record, and I want to say, Mr. Welch, that it has been labeled long before he became a member, as early as 1944.
Senator, may we not drop this? We know he belongs to the Lawyers Guild. And Mr. Cohen nods his head at me. I did you, I think, no personal injury, Mr. Cohen.
No, sir.
I meant to do you no personal injury. And if I did, I beg your pardon. Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
I know this hurts you, Mr. Welch.
And this switches the tide of public opinion very slowly of this time period from 1950 to 1954, which is at the heart of the opera, fellow travelers. This is the time period that is being discussed throughout the opera. The opera is specifically dealing, however, with a facet of the Red Scare and of McCarthyism, and that is the Lavender Scare. For it was during the period of the 1950s and beyond, and even before, that anyone who was gay or anyone who was supposed to be gay or presumed to be gay was seen as more susceptible to communism because of possibly more liberal views or because of the opportunity for blackmail from foreign agents. Now, of course, this was entirely ludicrous, this connection that was made by McCarthy and others. But that didn't mean that the idea didn't take hold. And hundreds, as you see here, 400 more homosexuals ousted from government jobs. Thousands of people lost their jobs, again, starting in the State Department and beyond. And so Fellow Travelers tells the story of two gay men living in the system, living in the political life and kind of center of McCarthyism, and grappling with what it means to live in a society that is oppressive and a society that does not allow them to live authentically. This is a story that is ripe for operatic adaptation. And so I can see how Gregory Spears, Greg Pierce, and Kevin Newberry, when looking at the novel by Thomas Mallon, saw the operatic potential of this horrible moment in American life. I also want to quickly emphasize here that Fellow Travelers is really an historical opera. It is an opera that is depicting a time period. And so there are things that happen in it that might make us a little uncomfortable in terms of things that characters say or character traits of even our two main protagonists. But this is an opera that is immersing you in the world of these men, that is immersing you in what it would have felt like to be there during this time period, and really forces us to deal with the human cost of living in this kind of society. This opera is also famous for its realistic depiction of gay life and its complexity and its intimacy. And it by no means represents the entire experience of the LGBTQ plus community, but it is simply one microcosm of one moment in time that can have cosmic ramifications. For it is yet another example of people who are forced to live inauthentically in a society that is afraid of who they are. So let's now talk about these characters that we meet, particularly the two men who are at the center and the heart of this work. And that is Hawkins Fuller and Tim Laughlin. Hawkins, or Hawk as he is called, is here on the left. and Tim is on the right. And immediately you notice some different character traits here. In our production, you will see Hawkins Fuller portrayed by Joseph Latanzi, who is the singer at the top here on the right side of your screen, who originated the role of Hawk in 2016. The role was basically written for him and has been a stunning advocate for this work. And the role of Tim will be played by Andres Acosta, a wonderful young tenor who's played Tim previously, but the two of them, Joseph Latanzi and Andres Acosta, have never played the opera together. So we're kind of seeing two greats in these roles come together on Virginia opera stages. Hawk Fuller is the older of the two, and he works in the State Department. And he, by virtue of being older, more mature, more kind of street smart, has kind of perfected how to live a double life as a gay man and as a non-presenting gay man in his job. And so he is very comfortable meeting people, living in secret, trying not to get too attached. He is able to lie very convincingly, and he's very, very, very charming. He has this down to a science in order to figure out how to survive as a person in this time period. He meets at the early part of the opera Tim Laughlin, or Skippy, as he's also called in the opera, particularly by Hawk. And Tim has just graduated from college, so he's a little more naive, and he is finishing up an internship with a newspaper when he happens to meet Hawk at a bench, as you see depicted here, in DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. To strike up a conversation, they realize that there is a possible connection there, and Hawk gets Tim a job working for Senator Potter. Senator Potter is one of the senators who is working with Joseph McCarthy in rooting out communists and therefore actively persecuting gay people in the federal government. What makes this opera so true to life is that these characters, the temptation could be to kind of just make them generally good guys and kind of stand in for kind of anyone who goes through this kind of experience. But just like in the novel, these characters are given depth. Timothy Laughlin struggles with coming from a very Catholic Irish family. And we see that depicted. After they spend a night together, Tim goes to church, and we see him kind of grapple with what has happened. We see in his work with Senator Potter that Tim ultimately is on the side of rooting out communists, that he believes in the kind of ideal work that is happening, whereas Hawk sees the kind of through his more cynical eyes the danger in the atrocities that are being committed. Hawk, on the other hand, has his own blind spots, and that takes root when Tim wants to take the relationship to the next level. He wants to admit his love for Hawk. He wants to live with Hawk. And Hawk refuses. He can't imagine a life where they can live happily together. And this creates moments of incredible tension and incredible heartbreak as this couple comes together and drifts apart throughout the course of this Lavender Scare from 1953 to 1954. When I saw this opera for the first time, I was so struck at how this was a story that allows its characters to be complex, allows them to be real, and shows on stage a story that just I had never experienced. And that kind of representation personally brought me to tears. So those are our two characters. They both have strengths. They both have weaknesses. They both have the opposite problem of the other. And again, that makes for great conflict and makes for great opera. So what is the more specific story that is happening here? Well, after these two meet, as I mentioned, Tim goes and works for Senator Potter. And the two then have a moment together in the apartment of Tim that you see here in the upper middle. And the relationship begins to grow through really incredible scene work and musical writing. Then at a Christmas party, Hawk, who is an object of desire for everyone in the office, is seen intimately with Tim, and an office worker who works for the State Department, Miss Lightfoot, sees the two of them and turns Hawk in to McCarthy and his team, and he goes before the investigations. As this is happening, Hawk's dear friend, Mary Johnson, who does not approve of what is happening with McCarthy and with the Lavender Scare, and is protective of both Hawk and Tim, kind of creating this platonic love triangle between the three, as she deeply is concerned for the well-being of these two men, and her heart breaks as their story unfolds. Hawk is then put in front of the investigation. We see that scene towards the end of Act 1. But Hawk, who, as I mentioned, has perfected this kind of double life, passes the test, if you will. And the test itself is heartbreaking to watch, but it's worth watching because we are seeing history unfold, and we're seeing the human side of that history versus what may happen in a documentary or something like that. Once this is all revealed, Tim is, of course, broken by what is happening. He then goes to Mary's house. We see that here. And the tension between Tim and Hawk eventually leads to them drifting apart. Tim needs something more committed in his life. Hawk can't see it. Tim is going to continue to fight for causes he believes in. Hawk isn't so sure. And so at the end of the opera, we see these characters drifting apart and realize the tragedy of their moment in that they cannot live authentically as themselves. The final image of the opera is Hawk walking away from the bench, and we see here in the back images of just some of the people who were affected by the Lavender Scare and whose lives were totally changed and uprooted because of the atrocities that we see committed. It's worth noting that the pictures that are shown in this production are not actual pictures of people who were fired, but they are meant to be representative of just the numbers and the individual stories, of which Hawk and Tim are just two of the lives that were changed because of this moment. This is an incredible distillation, this kind of journey of coming together and coming apart that we see in Fellow Travelers. It's a wonderful, wonderful work of adaptation by our librettist, Greg Pierce. And so as you think about the story of the opera, the adaptation, and the text that you will actually experience, a couple of things to be on the lookout for. First of all, we will see a fascinating mixture of what I call prosaic language and poetic language. Because this is a political story set in DC during this time of the Red and Lavender Scare, there's a lot of chatter. Right? You know, when we think of kind of political banter from, movies or TV shows or novels or even documentaries based on these kinds of events, there's a lot of in-talk, there's a lot of jargon, and we see that play out. But that kind of conversation that's very surface level, that is filled with names and all kinds of different things, is there so that it can contrast the incredible poetry of the true, the authentic, and the meaningful moments that take place in the opera. And in fact, the poetry of this opera tends to kind of happen in fragments. For example, as we'll hear in just a moment, when Tim goes to church after spending the night with Hawk, and he's thinking about last night, the poetry of that moment is really kind of fragmented as different thoughts are kind of coming to him and as he is free associating in beautiful and poetic ways. So we get this great contrast between chatter and poetry, what is true and what is surface. And we see that play out in the words that Greg Pierce has put together in this stunning piece. We see lots of fragmenting of thoughts and also repetition of thoughts. You'll notice as scenes progress and you'll have all of this chatter that slowly that will devolve into just a repetition back and forth of kind of the heart of what they're talking about. And the harmonies will kind of weave as the characters get to explore the subtext of what they're talking about on the surface, what's happening underneath, as the scene progresses. Fellow Travelers is also noteworthy because it features a lot of short scenes that give you these glimpses into the lives of the characters. This is not an opera that is attempting to dramatize every single moment of the relationship between Tim and Hawk and how their lives interact with the greater political and cultural moment that is happening around them. We are getting these snippets, these snapshots, these kind of cinematic breaks, if you will, of their lives as their relationship comes together and falls apart. It is a wonderful work of adaptation, and it is a wonderful example of what modern libretti are all about. Let's now turn our attention to the music, one of the things that people love the most about opera. And Gregory Spears is one of our great composers of our time period. And again, I love the fact that he's Virginian. I love that he grew up coming to Virginia Opera, and that is the heart of his operatic knowledge. Gregory Spears is noteworthy because his influences, remember this idea of kind of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, of bringing in lots of different musical influences into contemporary opera. His influences are not just classic opera or classical music. Greg Spears is interested in music that is much older and much newer. The entire kind of history of Western music is encapsulated in his music in surprising ways. Pay attention to some of the arias that you'll hear and some of what we call the ornamentation. That's when singers kind of riff on a melody that is written in by Greg Spears that almost sounds like medieval troubadour music or something like that, that is mashed up with a more modern idiom. A big part of Greg Spears' music is what is called minimalism, which is a technique of repetition, of introducing an idea and letting that be repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated so that when it does shift, it creates kind of the seismic change that you, the audience, notice. Again, you, the audience, are actively involved in this performance. So we have an incredible diversity of musical repertoire that's kind of filtered through these modern musical techniques that you'll hear in just a moment to create this chamber opera. What I mean by chamber opera is this is a piece that has a very limited cast. There is no chorus per se in this opera, and the orchestra is small. This is meant to be experienced as kind of an intimate work of art. So I encourage you, as you buy your tickets, to get as close to the stage as possible. That's not always my recommendation, but for this opera, you want to be right there, experiencing the drama and the relationship of Tim and Hawk as that unfolds throughout the Lavender Scare. So this is a great example of chamber opera, and Greg Spears is a master at this kind of musical intimacy. Notice that when each scene starts, you're given what Verdi would call a tinta, kind of tint, a vibe of the scene that really, not sets the tone of the opera at hand. And pay attention to the music of the political banter that we talked about with the libretto and the intimate conversations. To my ear, what sounds the newest, what is the most kind of modern music, is given the most prosaic language. So therefore, the kind of more modern music is a little more cynical, a little more political, a little more inside baseball. And the music that sounds older or is more expansive or is more lyrical, more song-like, is the music that is true. So when you really distill it down, this score, what sounds new, needs to be taken with a grain of salt. And what sounds old is what we can trust. That is the heart of the human condition and the human emotions that are here before us. Finally, this music, as you see in this very small image of the piano vocal score, incorporates a lot of different notes. There's a lot of figuration. There's a lot of kind of decoration that exists in the score that allows this piece to be beautiful, even if in its most ugly, dramatic moments, even as our hearts are breaking for Tim and Hawk. We are just surrounded by this style that just you can't fully describe. You have to experience it. And so let's take a moment and let's experience some of this music. I want to begin with the very beginning of the opera so that you get a sense of kind of what I'm talking about. And you're going to be introduced to this single tone that is repeated on the piano, and then the flute is added in. Bum, 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 bum. That's going to continue throughout. And you can interpret that however you will, but you have kind of this constant tone. And then around it weaves all of the different instruments as they're added in, creating this lush harmony. So we have kind of the truth of the human experience, of the human emotion, and then all of this other stuff kind of weaving around it. And pay attention to these ornaments. Again, these are kind of the riffs that we hear in the music that really harken back to a much older tradition than most opera composers incorporate. And so here at the beginning, we hear all of the musical styles that will be incorporated throughout the rest of the work. So I want you to take a second, close your eyes, and get into the vibe of this music, to get into the heart of allowing your of this opera and allowing your heart to slow or quicken to the tempo of the music and breathing along with it. Hear that repetition, that minimalism? Is that truth? Is that fear? You decide. Little ornament, da-da-da-da-da, starts to be passed around. Hear that note? Still there. Still there. Listen through the texture. Now pass that little figure to all the different parts of the orchestra. The warmth of that full orchestra. That music is just so stunning. It's so beautiful. And again, to take us back to the beginning of our time together, this is not what people think of when they think of modern music, because what they're thinking of with modern is actually a whole lot older than what's happening right now on the operatic stage. And so you get this beauty, you get this sense of forward motion, you get this sense of calm, you get this sense of tension all at once as you have this minimalist repetition and then these subtle changes and shifts with the harmonies around it. What a great example of Greg Spears' style as a composer, and also how to listen to contemporary music. As we listen to fellow travelers, this is a great opportunity, because it's a chamber piece, to listen down and through the orchestra, to keep all of the different instruments and all the different characters that each instrument represents and all of that, to keep it in your mind all at the same time. That's the real joy of modern music, and of all music in general, is to listen through that texture as all of these different truths are being played out at different times based on the line at play. So let's now turn our attention to one of the scenes in the opera, and I want to play the very beginning of the scene where Tim is coming to Hawk's office, coming to Senator Potter's office for an interview. So Hawk, they've met. Hawk is getting him a job at Senator Potter's office. And you'll notice this kind of banter, and the music is going to be a little faster, and it's going to be a little more modern sounding than kind of lush melodies that we'd associate with kind of typical opera. So notice the political element of this scene. And again, this is more modern, so therefore a little more insider DC. Orchestra kind of making the sounds of typewriters. Newsflash, newsflash.
Can I help you? I'm here for an interview with Senator Potter. My name's Timothy Laughlin. My name's Timothy Laughlin. Someone phoned for me, I work for the Star. Oh yes, Senator Potter's still at the hearings. He should be back soon if you wouldn't mind. Hey, who's got time to wait for a Potter? Might as well give you a try.
So a couple of things about that we just heard. We noticed that Tim had a little bit more lyrical music. My name's Timothy Laughlin. That's a melody that can get stuck in your head if you listen to it a couple times. And in fact, these melodies, these kind of lyrical moments are going to come back throughout the opera to kind of reminisce and to call back to different points as the drama unfolds. Notice how that lyricism was contrasted with the kind of jaggedness of those who are working in the office of Senator Potter, who are dealing with the investigations in McCarthy and all of those things that are surrounding us.
And now, Tommy McIntyre, Timothy Laughlin, hello Mick. I hear you can write a word or two. I was an English major at Oxford.
So the music of Tommy, if you just heard in those little 10 seconds, is more awkward. He is not at his heart a kind of warm person in the way that Tim is filled with melody. And so the way that the melody fits the character tells us everything we need to know about this character and this person, regardless of what they might be saying on the surface. Let's now, for the sake of time, contrast that with an element, an aria, a musical element for Tim and for Hawk. So you can hear the more lyrical expansion in contrast to that political banter and kind of thorniness that we heard in that brief scene. First, let's begin with the aria I've already alluded to, as Tim goes into the church and really thinks about the night that he had, that first night he had with Hawk, and grapples with his faith and grapples with all the issues that are surrounding this moment of incredible joy that is taking place. Beautiful and lush.
How many kisses, his hands, how many hours, how warm, how strong his hands. I died last night, how many hours.
Hearing that fragment, all these different thoughts, not even really a complete sentence.
I died last night. How many whispers? How did he know that I am his? How many sins did I commit last night? How many more? How many more?
Just that ornamentation that sounds very old and specific to Greg Spears.
How many more mornings? How many whispers? How many sins last night? How soon can I see him again? How many more nights last night? Forgive me, Holy Father. Forgive me, Holy Father.
And now we're in a whole different vibe, right? You heard that change.
That mortal sin kills the life of
And then he really grapples with this experience and with these feelings that he has. I love the figuration that begins this aria, that kind of expansive, full range that we get across the entire orchestra. To me, it sounds like the musical representation of like light coming in on stained glass windows, that kind of overwhelming, dazzling, glittering sensation that we get across this aria. And then when it shifts from this kind of overwhelming feeling that he has for Hawk and what he experienced last night, he can't even put a complete sentence together. He then kind of hones in at the issue issue at hand and what he's grappling with his faith and in the wider world around him. This is incredible operatic writing, again, filled with the lyricism of the character of Tim, hearkening back to a Mozart or something like that in terms of its just catchy, beautiful, essential melody. Let's now listen to some of the music that is given to Hawk, one of our main characters, but we haven't heard any of his music yet. So far, we've just heard examples for Tim, and this happens at the end of the opera. Tim and Hawk have gone their separate ways. Tim is absolutely heartbroken and emotional, and Hawk is as well, but in his way, as this member of this generation who did not grow up in a world where he could conceive of what it was to love another man. And so he sings this aria where he really is grappling with what it is that Tim wanted and why they can't have it. And notice how old this sounds. If you listen to medieval troubadour music, or you listen to music from far away distant places, like it has that kind of vibe. It's all entirely Greg Spears. This is still his musical idea, but it just has this old, true quality as we see someone realize the limits of their own thinking and own sense of identity. Excuse me. Wrong clip. Is that repetition again? Notice the figuration. And so you can hear that, like, just stripped down musical texture, and we hear those very idiosyncratic ornaments as essentially what happens to my ears, and this is my interpretation that I'm putting onto it, is that the oldest emotions, heartbreak, love, excitement, are given this older sounding style of music, but the text is inherently modern, is inherently new. He's talking about this image that he can't imagine of having his very own house with matching plates and different, colored towels, living the perfect domestic life with another man that he just can't fathom. That modern story, given this old, ancient influence, I think is really profound at the humanity that it connects us all. And regardless of your own identity and your own relationship to the subject matter here, we can all learn and grow and feel by seeing the relationship of Hawk and Tim unfold in this very specific time period, in this very specific moment of American life. The production that you will see here at Virginia Opera is the original production from Cincinnati. Again, Kevin Newberry is in Norfolk, working with our cast to bring this production to fruition. Normally in these Let's Talk Operas, I have to give a little disclaimer about the images that I'm showing, or the music isn't necessarily going to be the same. And in the case of Fellow Travelers, these images are going to be the production. It is an incredibly cinematic production. Everything unfolds and shifts and changes in smooth, choreographed ways that give this the feeling of a movie in many ways, while still maintaining that sense of intimacy and that sense of granular scale as you go throughout. If you're interested in listening to fellow travelers, if you've been annoyed that I've cut off clips right as things start to get good, or I was talking over that moment, not to worry. The full cast album is available on Spotify or anywhere that you get music. If you want to listen to this music to help you prepare and really kind of listen down and through the orchestra, listen to some of these ideas, comparing and contrasting the political jargon versus the more emotional, intimate moments, and take these ideas and hear them play out throughout the course of Fellow Travelers. And you will be hearing our Hawk in the recording, Joseph Latanzi, as our Hawk at Virginia Opera, along with a glittering, wonderful cast to fill out the rest of these roles as we see this story, this very intimate gem of a story, take place in this wider canvas and wider historical moment of the Red Scare and the Lavender Scare. I hope that our time together has given you a lot to think about. We've talked about kind of what's happening in contemporary opera and why that's different than what was happening 100 years ago during modernism. We talked about our three big trends of diversity, beauty, accessibility, and relevant storytelling that we see in these contemporary works. And then we saw those themes play out in Fellow Travelers as we looked at how this opera came to be based on the novel of Thomas Mallon, how the history of McCarthyism and the Red Scare, the Lavender Scare played out in American life, what it meant, what it is, and then how our specific story of Tim and Hawk unfolds, leading us to what to look for in the libretto, in the music, and in the production. I can't wait for you to experience this masterpiece of contemporary opera, and I look forward to seeing you at the opera. Get your tickets today. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments now. And I will keep an eye on those comments as we near opening night and beyond to answer any questions or to delight in this music along with you as we go on this journey together, as we are fellow travelers in this journey of this production from beginning to end. Thank you all so much, and see you at the opera.